Your vermin have trespassed onto common property for the last time, Mr. Caldwell. The voice, sharp and grating as rusted metal, cut through the peaceful morning air. I looked up from the fence post I was setting to see Karen, the president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, standing on the other side of my property line. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, overflowing with decades of complaints, her face set in a permanent scowl, and she held a clipboard clutched to her chest like a riot shield. Her floral print muumuu, a riot of clashing pinks and purples, did little to soften her formidable presence. It only made her look like a hostile, ambulatory garden gnome. Behind her, a few of my Narragansett Toms were pecking inquisitively at a dandelion that had dared to sprout on the manicured strip of grass the HOA called a greenbelt. They weren't bothering anyone, just being turkeys, but to Karen, their very existence was a personal affront. "This is your final warning," she declared, her voice rising with the self-righteous fury of a petty tyrant who just found a new infraction. "You have 48 hours to remove these creatures, all of them, or the association will take measures to have them removed for you, and you will be billed for the expense." She thrust a piece of paper through the fence wire, a freshly printed violation notice. The blocky, impersonal text cited code 14B, "No unauthorized livestock or poultry permitted." At the bottom, a fine was scrawled in angry red ink, $500. $500 for a turkey eating a weed? If you think that's insane, and I promise you we're just getting started, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you have an HOA nightmare of your own, I want to hear about it. You're going to want to see how this ends because Karen had just made the colossal mistake of declaring war on a man who spent 25 years in the U.S. Army, and she had no earthly idea what she was truly messing with. This wasn't just about some birds. This was about a promise, a legacy, and the piece of ground I'd earned as my sanctuary. I took the paper from her, my hand steady. I didn't raise my voice. I just folded it neatly and tucked it into my shirt pocket. "Message received, Karen," I said, my voice low and even. I looked past her, at my birds, then back at her face, which was already puffing up with indignation that I hadn't immediately groveled. She expected fear, or anger, or pleading. She wasn't prepared for calm. It was a look I'd seen on plenty of second-rate adversaries who mistook quiet for weakness. It was the look of someone about to get an education in the art of unintended consequences. The battle for Whispering Pines had just begun, and Karen, in her profound arrogance, had just handed me the declaration of war herself. She had no clue that the vermin she so casually threatened were part of one of the largest heritage breed conservation programs in the state, a project with deep roots and powerful allies she couldn't even imagine. She thought she was swatting a fly, but she just poked a bear. A very patient, very methodical bear who keeps excellent records. The turkeys gobbled softly behind me, almost as if in agreement, their iridescent feathers shimmering in the morning sun like a coat of arms. My journey to this particular patch of 20 acres on the outskirts of suburbia was a long one. After a career in Army logistics, planning and executing the movement of men and material across continents, I craved stillness. I wasn't looking for a mansion or a country club. I was looking for dirt I could call my own, a place where the only orders I had to follow were the changing of the seasons. I found it here, a rolling piece of land with a sturdy old farmhouse, a massive barn, and a creek that wound through a stand of ancient oaks. When I bought it, the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the only association I belonged to was the VFW. The land was my therapy, a place to decompress from years spent in places where the landscape was measured in threats and objectives. Here, the only objective was to bring the old farm back to life. The Heritage Turkey Program wasn't a whim. It was a mission I inherited. My best friend in the service, Sergeant Mike Kenner, had been a farm boy from rural Pennsylvania. He dreamed of retiring and saving the old breeds of livestock his grandfather had raised, the ones being pushed to extinction by industrial agriculture. He'd talk for hours about the intelligence of the bronze turkey, the beauty of the Narragansett, the unique history of the midget white. When we were pinned down in a sandblasted hellhole halfway around the world, those stories were an escape. They were a reminder of a sane, green world. Mike didn't make it back from that deployment. In his last letter home, He told his family that if anything happened, he wanted me to have his research, his contacts, and the nest egg he'd saved to start his conservation project. It was a sacred trust. So I took that trust, combined it with my pension, and turned my farm into the Kenner Heritage Breed Conservancy. It wasn't a business for profit. It was a living memorial, a registered conservation effort with the State University Agricultural Extension Program. Those weren't just creatures on my land. They were a genetic legacy, a flock of over 200 birds across 5 rare breeds, each one cataloged, tracked, and precious. Then came Whispering Pines Estates. It rose up like a fungus on the fields next to mine, a sprawling development of identical beige houses with identical manicured lawns. I watched it happen, but it wasn't my concern. My property was deeded long before the developer broke ground, and I was explicitly outside the planned community's boundaries. Or so I thought. What I hadn't counted on was phase 2. The developer went bankrupt, and a new company bought the remaining land, expanding the footprint right up to my fences. They absorbed the existing HOA, and in their hunger for dues-paying members, they used a legal sleight of hand, some fine print in a county zoning update, to retroactively rope in adjacent properties that used the same main access road. Suddenly, I was getting letters, welcome packets, and then the rule book, a book thicker than a Bible and twice as judgmental. And at the head of this new, expanded kingdom of conformity was Karen. She'd been president of the original, smaller HOA and saw the expansion as a promotion. Her domain had tripled, and with it, her sense of entitlement. She drove her golf cart, which she'd christened the Compliance Cruiser, along the perimeter of my property like a border guard, always searching for a violation. My rustic, unpainted barn fence, the unseemly sight of my restored 1953 Ford Jubilee tractor. And now, the turkeys. She had no concept of what they were, no interest in their history or purpose. To her, they were just another nail that needed to be hammered down, another deviation from the beige, sterile perfection she enforced with an iron fist. Her first official act as president of the newly expanded HOA was to send me a welcome letter that included a list of preemptive, observed potential violations on my property. It was a declaration of intent. I knew then that this wasn't going to be a simple live and let live situation. This was her territory now, and in her mind I was an insurgency that needed to be quashed. The $500 fine was just the opening salvo. I went back inside the farmhouse, the ridiculous violation notice still in my pocket. I opened the heavy oak filing cabinet in my office, a surplus military-grade beast that had seen more action than most people, and created a new file. I wrote on the tab in clean block letters, Operation Turkey Freedom. It was a habit from my old life. Give the mission a name. Define the objective. My objective was simple. Protect my property, protect Mike's legacy, and dismantle the petty tyrant who threatened both. I sat down at my desk and began to draft my first official response, not just as a homeowner, but as the director of a state-recognized conservation program. Karen wanted a war of paperwork. She was about to find out what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a full-scale logistical assault. The first volley in my paper counteroffensive was a formal, multi-page letter sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. In the Army, we learned that a paper trail is your best ammunition. I addressed the letter to the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors, deliberately not singling Karen out, forcing her to, by her own rules, share it with the other board members. The tone was professional, detached, and utterly devoid of the emotion she was hoping to provoke. I began by formally contesting the fine and the violation notice. I cited the specific date my property was purchased and deeded, a full decade before the Whispering Pines HOA was even a line on a developer's blueprint. I included a copy of my original deed, which contained no mention of any such covenants. I then addressed the specific bylaw she'd quoted, 14B, regarding unauthorized livestock. I attached a detailed 2-page summary of the Kenner Heritage Breed Conservancy. It outlined our mission, our nonprofit status, and our official partnership with the State University's Department of Poultry Science. I included a letter of support from the head of the department, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose name carried significant weight in agricultural circles. His letter described my flock not as livestock in the commercial sense, but as a vital genetic reservoir of historic agricultural assets. He used phrases like irreplaceable biodiversity and critical conservation effort. I was deliberately reframing the argument. Karen wanted to fight about chickens in a backyard. I was making it about saving an endangered species. I also attached a copy of the state's Right to Farm Act. I'd had my lawyer friend Dave review it last year when the development first started encroaching. The act was designed to protect existing agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits brought by new residential neighbors. It was a shield, and I was now formally putting the HOA on notice that I was standing behind it. I explained that my operation, predating their development and registered with the state, was a bona fide agricultural operation under the statute and thus protected from nuisance complaints regarding noise, smell, or sight, so long as we followed standard best practices, which we did meticulously. I concluded the letter by respectfully requesting that the board rescind the fine and issue a formal exemption for the Conservancy's activities. I also requested copies of the HOA's full unredacted meeting minutes for the past 2 years, the complete current budget and financial statements, and a record of all contracts entered into by the association, as was my right as a member. This was the flank attack. While she was focused on the turkeys, I was opening a new front on her governance. I knew from the sheer force of her personality that a woman like Karen didn't run a transparent organization. There were bound to be skeletons in that closet, and I was now officially asking for the key. The return receipt came back a week later, signed by Karen. Then silence. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. The 48-hour deadline came and went. No removal service appeared. I saw her golf cart patrolling the border several times, a grim look on her face. She was probably consulting the HOA's lawyer, a slick guy from a downtown firm who likely charged by the minute and had probably given her the unwelcome advice that I actually had a point. Then the second letter arrived. The fine was suspended pending review, a phrase that meant they knew they couldn't enforce it, but didn't want to admit defeat. However, the letter came with a fusillade of new complaints. A noise violation for excessive gobbling during quiet hours, which apparently ran 22 hours a day. A sanitation violation for unpleasant odors, despite the fact my pens were a good 300 yards from the nearest McMansion, and I kept them cleaner than most people's kitchens. And a new, more insidious one, a violation for running a commercial enterprise from a residential property, citing my unauthorized conservation program. They were twisting my own words against me. Each new violation came with a new fine, another $100 here, $250 there. It was a war of attrition. She was trying to bleed me dry, to make it so expensive and so frustrating that I would just give up. She was probing for weaknesses, trying to find an angle that would stick. I documented everything. Each letter was scanned and filed in Operation Turkey Freedom. I took daily decibel readings of the ambient noise at my property line. The loudest sound was usually the lawnmowers from her side of the fence. I had a soil and air quality test done by an independent lab, which came back showing my farm was cleaner than the common areas that were perpetually sprayed with pesticides and chemical fertilizers. For the commercial enterprise violation, I sent back a copy of my nonprofit registration and a letter from my accountant showing the Conservancy had never generated a single dollar of profit. Every penny went back into feed, veterinary care, and incubation equipment. I responded to each new charge with the same calm, methodical barrage of facts, evidence, and legal citations. I was creating a mountain of paperwork that would be impossible for them to ignore if this ever went to court. I was building a fortress of reason against her siege of nonsense. But I knew this defensive strategy wouldn't be enough. Karen wasn't a rational actor. She was driven by ego and a lust for control. Facts wouldn't deter her, they would only enrage her. To win this war, I couldn't just defend my position. I had to go on the offensive. It was time to start investigating the Queen of Whispering Pines herself. My request for the HOA's financial records and meeting minutes had, so far, been met with a stony silence. That silence was my next target. It was the loudest sound in the whole neighborhood. My formal request for the HOA's records was not just ignored, it was actively stonewalled. According to the bylaws, the very documents Karen weaponized against everyone else, any member in good standing was entitled to review the association's financial records with reasonable notice. I had given notice. I was, despite her avalanche of fines, a member in good standing until proven otherwise. Her refusal to comply was, in itself, a violation of the HOA's own governing documents. This was the first crack in her armor, and I intended to drive a wedge into it. I sent a second certified letter, this time citing the specific bylaw that guaranteed my right to access and stating that their failure to respond to my initial request within the mandated 30-day window was a breach of their fiduciary duty. I gave them a new deadline, 10 business days. Failure to comply, I wrote, will compel me to seek legal remedies to enforce the association's own rules. I was using her language, her tactics, turning the bureaucratic machinery back on its operator. While I waited for the inevitable response, I began my own reconnaissance. An organization is just a group of people, and people talk. I started taking my morning coffee on my front porch, which overlooked the main road into the development. I learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, the morning rush of commuters, the midday dog walkers, the afternoon school bus run. I made a point of being visible, friendly and non-threatening. I'd give a nod or a wave to cars passing by. My first real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an elderly gentleman named Arthur, who I'd see every morning on his slow, methodical walk with his ancient beagle. One day he paused by my fence. "That's a Narragansett, isn't it?" he asked, pointing a shaky finger at one of my younger Toms strutting near the road. "My grandfather raised them. Haven't seen one in 60 years. I walked over, a thermos of coffee in my hand. "It is," I said, pouring a cup for him into the thermos lid. "I run a conservation program for old heritage breeds." Arthur's eyes lit up. We talked for nearly an hour about his grandfather's farm, about the birds, about the old ways. He'd lived here for 30 years, long before it was Whispering Pines. His house, like mine, had been absorbed into the HOA. "This place used to be nice," he sighed, sipping the coffee. "Then she took over." He didn't have to say who she was. She runs it like it's her own private kingdom. The board just rubber stamps whatever she wants. They're all scared of her. He told me about the treasurer, a young man named Ben, who had tried to ask questions about the budget in a meeting last year. Karen had publicly humiliated him, accusing him of incompetence and orchestrating a campaign of petty violations against him until he resigned from the board and moved out of the neighborhood. "Nobody stood up to her since," Arthur said, his voice dropping. "Be careful, son. She doesn't fight fair." His warning was confirmation of what I already suspected. Karen's power wasn't just based on the rules. It was based on fear and intimidation. The other board members weren't her allies. They were her hostages. 10 days later, I received a thick envelope from the HOA's lawyer. It wasn't the documents I'd requested. It was a cease and desist letter accusing me of a campaign of harassment against the HOA board and threatening legal action if I continued my frivolous and burdensome requests. Attached was a heavily redacted one-page budget summary that was about as informative as a blank sheet of paper. It had line items like landscaping, $150,000, administrative, $45,000, and legal retainer, $50,000. There were no details, no vendor names, no check registers. It was a financial smokescreen. The landscaping budget immediately jumped out at me. $150,000 for what? Mowing a few greenbelts and putting mulch around the Whispering Pines sign at the entrance? It was an absurdly high number. This wasn't just a clue. It was a flashing neon sign. I took the letter and the budget summary over to the home of my old Army buddy, Dave Miller. Dave had been a JAG officer before opening his own private practice specializing in forensic accounting and corporate law. He was the kind of lawyer who enjoyed digging through other people's garbage, both literal and metaphorical. I spread the documents out on his dining room table. "What do you make of this, Dave?" He read through the letters, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Classic Stonewall. They're hiding something. Something big." He tapped the landscaping line item with his pen. "This is your entry point, Jack. $150,000 is insane unless they're planting solid gold trees. This is where the bodies are buried. He leaned back in his chair. She's refused a legal request for records. She's provided a meaningless summary. She's using the HOA's lawyer to intimidate you. This is a classic pattern for a board president engaged in self-dealing or embezzlement. Dave laid out a plan. We would file a formal petition with the court to compel the release of the documents. It was a simple legal procedure, but one that would force the HOA's hand. They would either have to produce the real records or be in contempt of court. But while we do that, Dave said, his eyes glinting, you do some old-fashioned recon. Find out who does the landscaping. Get a name. Evergreen Solutions, Mighty Mow, whatever. Find out who owns it. I'll bet you a bottle of good, single malt. It's not a stranger. The next morning, I was parked in a discreet spot with a view of the main entrance at 6 a.m. I had a long-lens camera and a fresh thermos of coffee. For 2 days, I saw nothing but a couple of guys in a beat-up pickup with a mower on the back. The kind of small-time crew that charges a few $100 a week. They certainly weren't a $150,000 a year operation. On the third day, I hit pay dirt. A gleaming new truck, emblazoned with a professionally designed logo, pulled up to the entrance. The logo was a stylized pine tree with flowing green letters. Evergreen Landscape and Design. A man got out and spent 20 minutes fussing with the petunias in the entrance flower bed. I got a clear shot of the truck, the logo, and the man's face. I ran the company name through the state's online business registration portal. Evergreen Landscape and Design, LLC, registered agent and sole proprietor, Frank Miller. The name didn't mean anything to me. I did a quick social media search, nothing. Then I cross-referenced the address listed on the business registration. It was a residential address in the next town over. A quick search of property tax records for that address gave me the owner's name, Frank and Susan Miller. Susan Miller. I typed that name into a search engine along with Karen's last name, Peterson. The first hit was a local newspaper announcement from 5 years ago, celebrating the 50th wedding anniversary of Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Listed among the attendees were their 2 daughters, Karen Peterson and Susan Miller. Dave owed me a bottle of scotch. Karen was paying her own sister's husband $150,000 a year in HOA funds to plant petunias. This was no longer about turkeys. This was about grand larceny hiding in plain sight, and I now had the evidence to prove it. Armed with the knowledge of Karen's blatant self-dealing, I knew I had to tread carefully. A direct accusation without broader support would just be my word against hers, and she controlled the board and the narrative. Before exposing the rot within the HOA's finances, I needed to build a coalition. I needed to show that her abuse of power wasn't just directed at me, but was a systemic problem affecting the entire community. I started with Arthur, the old man who had first tipped me off to Karen's reign of terror. I visited him with a dozen fresh eggs from my non-turkey poultry, a small flock of heritage chickens I also kept. We sat on his porch and I laid out what I had found, not as an accusation, but as a series of questions. Arthur, I was looking at the budget summary they sent me. Does $150,000 a year for landscaping sound right to you? He nearly choked on his iced tea. 150? Good heavens, no. They mow the common strips once a week in the summer and throw down some mulch once a year. My grandson does that kind of work. It shouldn't cost a tenth of that. I then showed him the business registration for Evergreen Landscape and Design and the newspaper clipping connecting it to Karen's sister. Arthur's face, already weathered, seemed to harden. That crooked old bat, he muttered. It all makes sense now. The special assessments for beautification projects that never seem to amount to much. The constant nickel and diming on us while she spends a fortune on that. He pointed toward the ostentatious floral arrangements at the community entrance. He told me about Maria Rodriguez, an elderly widow who lived down the street. Karen had waged a 6-month war against her over a bird bath. It was a gift from her late husband, a simple concrete basin, but Karen had deemed it non-compliant statuary and fined Maria repeatedly until the heartbroken woman finally gave in and put it in her garage. Maria was devastated, Arthur said. That bird bath was the one thing she looked forward to seeing in her garden. My next visit was to Maria, I brought her a small basket of vegetables from my garden. She was hesitant at first, her eyes full of the weary fear I was beginning to recognize in the neighborhood. I didn't mention Karen or the HOA. I just talked about gardening, about the finches and cardinals in the area. Eventually, she invited me in. Her house was immaculate, filled with photos of a smiling man I assumed was her husband. After a while, I gently brought up the bird bath. Tears welled in her eyes. She said it was against the rules, Maria whispered, as if Karen might hear her. She sent letters, so many letters. I couldn't afford the fines. My husband, he made it for me. I listened, my anger coiling into a cold, hard knot in my gut. This wasn't about rules. This was about cruelty. It was about a bully deriving pleasure from the pain of others. I told her, Maria, I believe the rules are being applied unfairly. I'm looking into it. You're not alone. I didn't ask her to do anything, just to know that someone was finally fighting back. My final stop was the Harrisons, a young couple with two small children. Their story was infamous in the neighborhood. They had saved for a year to build a beautiful wooden playset in their backyard for their son and daughter. 2 days after it was finished, Karen descended. The stain on the wood was canyon brown, but the approved color was cedar natural. The distinction was nearly imperceptible, but it was enough. She gave them a choice: tear it down or face a $100 a day fine until it was removed. They couldn't afford the fines, so with heavy hearts, they dismantled the playset their children had just begun to enjoy. I found Mark Harrison in his driveway, washing his car. I introduced myself, and he was wary. My farm, the source of the HOA's latest controversy, was well known. Look, I'm not here about the turkeys, I said plainly. I'm here about Karen. I heard what happened with your kid's playset. His jaw tightened. Yeah, well, rules are rules, I guess. Are they? I asked. Or are they just whatever Karen decides they are on any given day? I told him about Maria's bird bath. I told him about the financial records, the stonewalling, and the landscaping contract with her brother-in-law. I wasn't trying to sell him anything. I was just laying out the facts, man to man. She's using this community's money to enrich her own family, while she bullies the rest of you over the color of a wood stain, I said. Does that seem right to you? A flicker of anger crossed his face, replacing the resignation. What can we do? She controls everything. She'll just fine us into oblivion. Not if we stand together, I said. She can't fine all of us. Her power comes from isolating us, making us feel like we're the only ones. We're not. I gave him my phone number. I'm having a lawyer file a petition to get the real financial records. When I get them, I'm going to need support. I'm not asking you to do anything now. Just think about it. Over the next week, my phone started to ring. First, it was Mark Harrison. My wife and I are in, he said, his voice firm. What do you need? Then, Maria called, hesitantly at first. Arthur had spoken to her again, and she wanted to help. Soon, others followed. A man who was fined for having his garbage cans visible from the street for 2 hours past the deadline. A woman forced to remove a small flag from her flower bed because it wasn't the American flag. The stories poured in, a litany of petty abuses and vindictive punishments. I documented every single one, creating a dossier for each resident, complete with photos, dates, and copies of the violation notices. Operation Turkey Freedom was no longer just my mission. It had grown into the Whispering Pines Liberation Front. Karen thought she was fighting one stubborn old soldier. She had no idea she was about to face a popular uprising, and I was about to give them the ammunition they needed to fight back. Dave filed the petition. A court date was set. Karen and the HOA were being legally compelled to bring their books out into the light. The next phase of the operation was about to begin. The court order was a thing of beauty. A judge, after reviewing Dave's petition and the HOA's flimsy attempts at justification, had compelled them to produce 5 years of unredacted financial records, including bank statements, check registers, invoices, and all signed contracts. They were given 14 days. The day the boxes of documents arrived at Dave's office was like Christmas morning for a forensic accountant. We spent the entire weekend holed up in his conference room, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. The room was soon covered in spreadsheets, bank statements, and invoices, a paper mosaic of Karen's corruption. It was worse than I had imagined. The evergreen landscape and design contract was the tip of the iceberg. We found the original contract signed by Karen as president and suspiciously by her brother-in-law Frank as the contractor. There was no competitive bidding process as required by the bylaws for any contract over $10,000. She had simply awarded a six-figure annual contract to her own family. The invoices were even more damning. They were vague and repetitive. Monthly grounds maintenance, $12,500. There was no itemization, no breakdown of labor or materials. It was a blatant monthly transfer of community funds into her family's pockets. But it didn't stop there. We found payments to a consulting firm called Pinecone Strategies. A quick search revealed it was a shell company registered to Karen's home address. She was paying herself a consulting fee of $2,000 a month on top of her official, unpaid position as president. There were purchases on the HOA credit card for expensive dinners, high-end electronics, and even a charge for a spa day listed under Board Wellness Retreat. She was treating the HOA's bank account like her personal piggy bank. Dave, poring over the statements with a highlighter, let out a low whistle. This isn't just breaking the rules, Jack. This is wire fraud. This is embezzlement. This is felony-level stuff. We're talking hard time. As we dug deeper, we saw how she funded her lavish spending. It was through the constant, relentless fining of residents for petty infractions and the levying of special assessments for phantom projects. Maria's bird bath fines, the Harrisons' playset threats, Arthur's improperly stored garden hose, it all flowed into the same pot she was skimming from. She wasn't just a bully. She was a thief using cruelty as a tool to fund her greed. The most critical piece of evidence we found was related to the state's Right to Farm Act. In the meeting minutes from 2 years prior, the HOA's previous lawyer had explicitly warned the board that my property was likely exempt from livestock prohibitions due to its pre-existing agricultural use. The lawyer recommended seeking a cooperative agreement rather than a confrontation. Karen had apparently ignored this legal advice completely. A handwritten note in the margin of the minutes, in what I recognized as her distinctive, florid script, read, "Unacceptable. Must enforce compliance." She knew she was on shaky legal ground from the very beginning. She knew and she didn't care. Her ego wouldn't allow for an exemption. Her kingdom could have no exceptions. This single note proved intent. It showed that her entire campaign against me was not just a misinterpretation of the rules, but a willful and malicious attack undertaken against the advice of her own counsel. With this arsenal of evidence, it was time to move from the legal front to the public one. Karen thrived in the shadows, her power magnified by whispers and fear. I was about to drag her and her dirty secrets into the brightest spotlight I could find. But first, I needed to bait the trap. I sent one last letter to the HOA board. This time, I didn't bother with certified mail. I sent it via email and copied Mark Harrison, Arthur, and a dozen other residents who had joined our cause. The email was short and to the point. I stated that I had reviewed the financial records and had uncovered what I believed to be significant financial mismanagement and multiple conflicts of interest. I formally requested a special meeting of the homeowners, as was our right under the bylaws if petitioned by 10% of the membership, to discuss these findings. I attached the petition with the required signatures. I gave them 7 days to schedule the meeting, or we would schedule it ourselves at the community clubhouse, a public space owned by all members. I knew Karen would react furiously. Her carefully constructed world was about to be breached, but I misjudged the form her fury would take. I expected more legal threats, more bluster. I didn't expect her to escalate things on the ground against the turkeys themselves. 2 days after I sent the email, I received a call from a frantic-sounding neighbor. "Jack, you need to get home. There's a man from animal control at your fence, and Karen's with him." I was at the feed store, but I broke every speed limit getting back. This was a dangerous escalation. A negative report from a government agency could give her the leverage she needed to override the right to farm protections. It was a direct assault on the legal foundation of my defense. When I screeched to a halt in my driveway, the scene was exactly as my neighbor described. A white county van with animal services on the side was parked on the road. A young uniformed officer, whose name tag read Miller, was standing awkwardly by my fence, clipboard in hand, and next to him, practically vibrating with smug triumph, was Karen. She had a look of pure, unadulterated victory on her face. She had finally brought in the authorities. This, she believed, was the checkmate. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice dripping with false concern, "I was forced to call animal control. We've received numerous complaints about the unsanitary conditions and the potential for disease from your flock. It's a public health issue." I ignored her completely. My focus was on Officer Miller. I walked up to him, extending a hand. "Colonel Jack Caldwell," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I run this conservancy. What seems to be the problem, son?" Miller, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked relieved to be talking to someone who wasn't Karen. "Sir, we got a call reporting a large number of birds in poor health, living in squalor. Standard procedure? I have to come and check it out." "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to give you a full tour. Please come in." I unlatched the gate and led him onto the property. Karen tried to follow, but I turned and put a hand up. "This is a biosecure area, Karen. Only authorized personnel. You can wait by the road." Her face turned a shade of mottled purple, a mix of fury and astonishment. Being barred from my property, the place she was trying to control, was an indignity she couldn't stomach. But with the officer present, she couldn't force her way in. She was left to fume on the other side of the fence, a spectator at her own party. I led Officer Miller toward the main pens. He was expecting a filthy, overcrowded coop. What he saw was a series of spacious, meticulously maintained enclosures, each with its own self-watering system, clean bedding of fresh pine shavings, and free-range access to rotating pastures of clover and alfalfa. The birds themselves were magnificent, bright-eyed, with clean feathers and confident strides. There was no foul odor, only the clean, earthy smell of a well-run farm. "Wow," Miller said, genuinely impressed. "This is not what I was expecting." I opened the door to my utility building. "This is our vet station and record room," I explained. I showed him my logs, daily health checks for every bird, detailed veterinary records from a licensed avian vet who visited quarterly, and my meticulous feeding schedules tailored to each breed's specific nutritional needs. I showed him the high-end incubators for the spring hatching season and the quarantine pens for new arrivals. Finally, I showed him my file from the State University, the official registration for the Kenner Heritage Breed Conservancy, and the letter of commendation from Dr. Finch. "Officer," I said, "what you were told was a public health hazard is actually a state-recognized genetic preservation project. These birds are rarer than a lot of animals you'd find in a zoo. We operate under the highest standards of animal husbandry." Miller was scribbling notes on his clipboard, but he was also shaking his head in disbelief. "Sir, I've been on calls for actual animal neglect. This is the exact opposite of that. This is one of the most professional operations I've ever seen, hobby or commercial." We walked back toward the front gate, where Karen was still waiting, her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. Officer Miller faced her, his expression now firm and official. "Ma'am, I've completed my inspection. There are no violations here. In fact, this facility exceeds all state and county standards for animal welfare. I'll be filing a report indicating complaint unfounded. Please don't waste the county's resources with baseless calls again." Karen's jaw dropped. She stared at Miller, then at me, her mind unable to process this turn of events. Her ultimate weapon had not only misfired, but had backfired spectacularly. The authority she had tried to use against me had just publicly validated me. But the smell, the noise," she stammered, grasping at straws. "Ma'am," Miller said, his patience clearly gone, "the only thing I smell is cut grass and that lady's perfume. Have a good day, Colonel." He tipped his hat to me, got in his van, and drove away. I was left standing at my gate, facing a completely defeated Karen. The smugness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. She had been publicly contradicted and dismissed. For a person like her, that was worse than any fine. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "There's a meeting. You wanted a meeting? You'll get one. And you'll regret it." She spun around and stomped back to her golf cart, leaving a palpable trail of rage in the air. I knew then that the special meeting wouldn't just be a discussion. It would be a showdown. She was going to try and make it her last stand, a public execution where she could rally her supporters and crush the rebellion. What she didn't know was that I was counting on it. Her rage was making her sloppy. She had just announced the time and place of her own downfall. The community clubhouse was about to become a courtroom, and she had just volunteered to be the star witness for the prosecution. The night of the special meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Karen had, as I predicted, framed the meeting as a referendum on my farm. She'd sent out a notice titled, "Protecting Our Property Values and Community Standards," which painted a dire picture of a neighborhood under siege by rogue agricultural activity. It was a call to arms for her loyalists, and they had turned out, occupying the front rows with grim, determined faces. But our side had turned out too. Mark Harrison and his wife were there, as were Arthur and Maria. In the back and along the sides of the room stood dozens of other residents I had spoken to, the quiet, intimidated homeowners who had finally decided they'd had enough. They held copies of their own violation notices, a silent testament to Karen's reign. I had set up a projector and a screen at the front of the room, next to the podium. Karen eyed it with suspicion, but I had every right to present my case. Dave was there, seated in the front row of my supporters, looking more like a concerned homeowner than a high-powered attorney. He was my ace in the hole, there to observe and ensure all procedures were followed correctly. Karen, dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit that made her look like a warden, called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. She launched into a prepared speech, her voice resonating with practiced indignation. She spoke of harmony, of shared values, of the tireless work the board did to maintain the pristine character of Whispering Pines. She portrayed me as an outsider, a stubborn nonconformist who threatened to drag down everyone's property values with my filthy, noisy birds. She painted herself as the lone defender of the community, the shield protecting them from my rural blight. "This man," she declared, pointing at me, "wants to operate a commercial farm in our backyards. He has refused to comply with our rules, he has harassed your board, and he threatens the very foundation of our community. Tonight, we must send a clear message. We are also here to vote on a necessary special assessment of $20,000 to fund the legal battle to force Mr. Caldwell's compliance and ensure our neighborhood remains a desirable place to live." A murmur went through the crowd. $20,000 was a steep price. Her supporters nodded dutifully, but I saw looks of concern on many other faces. When she finished, to a smattering of applause from the front rows, she said, "Mr. Caldwell has requested time to speak. The board has graciously granted him 5 minutes." She said graciously, as if she were bestowing a great gift. I walked to the podium. I didn't look at Karen. I looked at the faces in the crowd, at Maria, at the Harrisons, at the dozens of people who had been bullied into silence. "My name is Jack Caldwell," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I'm a 25-year veteran of the United States Army, and I am the owner of the 20-acre property at the end of the road. Karen is right about one thing. This meeting is about protecting our community. But it's not about my turkeys. It's about our money, our rights, and the abuse of power." I clicked the remote for the projector. The first image that appeared on the screen was a picture of Maria's simple bird bath. This bird bath belonged to Maria Rodriguez's late husband. She was fined over $800 and threatened with a lien on her home until she removed it. I clicked again. A picture of the Harrisons' half-finished playset. This playset was for the Harrison children. The family was fined $100 a day because the wood stain was the wrong shade of brown. I went through a dozen more examples, showing pictures of garbage cans, small garden flags, a basketball hoop. With each one, I stated the name of the family and the absurd infraction. The murmur in the room grew louder. People were turning to look at their neighbors, seeing their own private frustrations reflected in public. Then I switched the slide. The HOA's budget summary appeared, the one with the $150,000 line item for landscaping. "This is the budget we are allowed to see," I said, "but as members, we have a right to see the details. After being forced by a court order, your board finally released the real records." I clicked again. A copy of the Evergreen Landscape and Design contract appeared on the screen, with Karen's signature clearly visible. This is a $150,000 annual contract for landscaping, awarded without a single competing bid. I clicked again. The business registration for Evergreen, showing the owner as Frank Miller. I clicked one last time. The newspaper clipping showing Karen Peterson and her sister Susan Miller at their parents' anniversary party. Frank Miller, I said, my voice dropping into the now silent room, is Karen's brother-in-law. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a sound of dawning comprehension and outrage. But it doesn't stop there, I continued, my voice like a hammer striking an anvil. I showed them the payments to her personal consulting company. I showed them the credit card statements with the spa days and fancy dinners, the money from Maria's fines, the money they tried to extort from the Harrisons, the $20,000 special assessment she's asking for tonight. This is where it goes. It goes to fund a lifestyle, not a community. Karen was on her feet, her face pale, a mask of fury and panic. This is an outrage. These are lies. This is an illegal presentation of private documents. These are your documents, Karen, I said, turning to face her directly for the first time. This is your signature, and these are your neighbors you've been stealing from. I had one last slide. It was the page from the meeting minutes, the one where her own lawyer had warned her that my farm was protected. I zoomed in on her handwritten note. Unacceptable. Must enforce compliance. This was never about the rules, I told the crowd. It was about control. She knew from the beginning she had no legal standing to come after my farm, but she did it anyway, wasting thousands of your dollars on lawyers to pursue her personal vendetta. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing at Karen. Her supporters looked stunned, betrayed. The foundation of her power, the illusion of her righteous authority, had crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. Karen, cornered and exposed, made her final, fatal error. She grabbed the gavel and began banging it furiously. Order! This meeting is adjourned. Any vote is postponed. She tried to flee, to shut it all down, but Dave stood up. Madam President, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with legal authority, a motion has been made to vote on a special assessment. The bylaws require that vote to take place. Furthermore, a petition has been submitted to discuss the financial conduct of the board. You cannot unilaterally adjourn this meeting to evade that discussion. The trap had been sprung. She was legally bound to continue the meeting she had orchestrated for my destruction. She was trapped on stage under the glare of the projector and the furious eyes of the community she had betrayed. Panic had completely overtaken Karen's features. The carefully constructed mask of the benevolent dictator had shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered woman underneath. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found only a sea of angry, accusing faces. The front row sycophants who had applauded her speech were now sinking in their seats, trying to become invisible. Her power had evaporated in an instant, and she knew it. This is a conspiracy, she shrieked, her voice cracking. He has poisoned you against me. These documents are doctored. Mark Harrison stood up, his voice shaking with anger but clear and strong. Doctored? I have the originals of the 4 violation notices you sent me for my kid's playset right here, Karen. Are they doctored too? Or how about the notice you sent the Patels for their son's graduation banner? Or the one you sent Mr. Henderson for his oil stain on his driveway? We've all got them. We're all tired of it. One by one, others stood up, holding their own pieces of paper, their own stories of petty tyranny. It was a visual tidal wave of dissent. The room was no longer a collection of individuals. It was a unified body, and its anger was directed squarely at the woman on the stage. Karen, seeing her authority collapsing, made a desperate final power play. It was an act of pure, self-destructive hubris. Fine, she yelled over the noise. You want to talk about rules? Let's talk about rules. The fact remains that this man, she jabbed a finger at me, is housing a flock of filthy, diseased birds in violation of our covenants. The board has an emergency duty to protect this community. I don't need your vote. It was a stunning admission, a public declaration that she believed her powers superseded the bylaws, the members, and any semblance of democratic process. She had just confessed to being the tyrant we all knew she was. She turned to the two other board members on stage with her, a timid-looking man and a woman who looked like she was about to faint. The board has already voted to engage a wildlife removal service to handle this nuisance once and for all. It's an emergency action. This was the moment Dave and I had been waiting for. This was the illegal act she was now confessing to in front of 100 witnesses. An emergency action required a true emergency, a fire, a flood, an imminent danger. A flock of peaceful turkeys didn't qualify. More importantly, spending funds on such a service without a vote, especially after a petition had been filed to review her financial conduct, was a gross misuse of authority and a clear breach of her fiduciary duty. Dave calmly stood up again. Madam President, could you please clarify for the record? Are you stating that you have, without a vote from the membership, already retained an authorized payment to a third-party contractor to enter private property and seize assets belonging to a member of this association? Karen, blinded by rage, walked right into it. Yes, it's my duty. I am protecting this community from him, she screamed. Thank you for clarifying, Dave said, sitting down and making a note on his legal pad. He gave me a subtle nod. She just hung herself with her own words on the record. The meeting descended into chaos. A motion was made from the floor by Arthur to immediately suspend Karen and the current board pending a full audit and a recall election. The motion was seconded by a dozen people at once. A vote was called. It was nearly unanimous. Karen stood there, gavel in hand, as her kingdom was dismantled vote by vote. She was stripped of her title, her power, and her dignity in the very room she had intended to use for my humiliation. Defeated, she threw the gavel down on the podium, where it clattered and fell to the floor. She shoved her way through the crowd, ignoring the jeers and accusations, and fled the clubhouse. The rebellion had succeeded. We had won. But I knew Karen. A woman that obsessed with control wouldn't just accept defeat. Her final desperate act was yet to come. I knew her confession about the wildlife removal service wasn't just a threat. She was arrogant enough to have already set it in motion. Her parting shot was already in the air, and my turkeys were the target. I left the jubilant crowd at the clubhouse and drove home, my mind already shifting from public relations to base defense. I had spent the last week preparing for this possibility. I had installed a series of high-definition, motion-activated security cameras covering all angles of my property, especially the turkey pens. They fed directly to a recording unit and to my phone. I also made 2 phone calls. The first was to the county sheriff's department, to the personal cell of a deputy I knew from a local veterans group. I briefed him on the situation. A disgruntled and now suspended HOA president had threatened to illegally hire a service to come onto my property and remove what amounted to valuable protected livestock. I told him I had reason to believe she would be reckless enough to still try it, likely in the early morning hours. He promised to have a patrol car in the area. My second call was to Dr. Finch at the State University. I explained the situation and the imminent threat to the conservation flock. He was livid. He informed me that interfering with a registered conservation program of this nature carried its own set of stiff state-level penalties, and that he would be contacting the State Department of Agriculture's Enforcement Division first thing in the morning. I stayed up all night, sitting in my darkened kitchen, watching the live feed from the cameras on a monitor, a pot of black coffee at my side. It felt like being on watch in a forward operating base again, waiting for an attack you knew was coming. Just before dawn, at 5:15 a.m., I saw it. A beat-up, unmarked panel van with no lights on rolled slowly past my property, then parked down the street. 2 shadowy figures got out, carrying long nets and catch poles. They crept toward my fence line. Karen's final desperate act of vengeance had arrived right on schedule. I picked up my phone. It was time for the final confrontation. The 2 men from the van were clumsy. They were clearly not professionals, just a couple of guys hired for a cheap, questionable job. They fumbled with the latch on my secondary pasture gate, the one furthest from the house. They obviously thought it would be unlocked. It wasn't. After a moment of frustrated whispering, one of them produced a pair of bolt cutters. The sharp snap as they cut the chain echoed in the quiet morning air. That was it. That was the line. They had now committed breaking and entering and destruction of property. I was already on the phone with the sheriff's deputy, narrating their every move as the cameras recorded it all in crystal clear night vision. "They've breached the fence, deputy. They are on my property, moving toward the pens." As they advanced, the turkeys, sensing the intruders, began to stir. A few low, nervous gobbles broke the silence. The men started trying to corner a group of my prized royal palm turkeys, swinging their nets wildly in the dim light. The birds, agile and surprisingly fast, easily dodged them, creating a chaotic scene of flapping wings and panicked gobbling. I stepped out onto my back porch, flipping on the powerful floodlights that illuminated the entire area. "You are trespassing on private property," I called out, my voice booming through the stillness. "You are being recorded. The sheriff is on his way." The two men froze like deer in headlights, suddenly exposed. They looked at each other in panic, dropped their nets, and made a run for it. They scrambled back over the fence and peeled out in their van, leaving their bolt cutters behind on my grass. It was a pathetic, failed raid. But they weren't the real target. A minute later, two vehicles arrived almost simultaneously. The first was the county sheriff's patrol car, lights flashing. The second was a sleek black sedan. A woman in a sharp suit got out, and I recognized her immediately from a newspaper photo. It was Eleanor Vance, the head of the Enforcement Division for the State Department of Agriculture. Dr. Finch was not a man who made idle threats. As the deputy began inspecting the cut chain and the abandoned nets, a third vehicle pulled up, driving far too fast. It was Karen's golf cart, the compliance cruiser. She must have been watching from down the street, and seeing the men flee and the sheriff arrive, she had come to try and salvage the situation, to assert her non-existent authority. It was the last mistake she would ever make as a person of power. She stormed onto my property, her face a mask of rage. "What is going on here? I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I authorize the removal of this nuisance," she bellowed, marching right up to the deputy. The deputy, a tall, no-nonsense man named Roberts, just looked at her. "Ma'am, you are the president of nothing. We've been monitoring your HOA situation. You were removed from your position last night." Karen froze. "And," he continued, his voice cold and official, "you authorized two men to illegally enter this property and attempt to steal livestock. That's a felony." Just then, Eleanor Vance from the Department of Agriculture stepped forward, holding up her badge. "Karen Peterson, I'm Director Vance with the State Department of Agriculture. This is a registered state conservation project. The animals you attempted to have removed are protected agricultural assets. Based on their pedigree and genetic rarity, their value is estimated at over $75,000. Karen's face went completely white. The number hung in the air, incomprehensible to her. She had thought she was dealing with backyard chickens. She had just tried to orchestrate the theft of a collection of living assets worth more than her car. Attempting to steal or harm animals in a registered conservation program carries severe penalties under state agricultural law, including fines of up to $10,000 per animal and possible prison time," Vance continued, her tone mercilessly professional. "And given that you used your position as an HOA official to do so, we'll also be looking into charges of abuse of office." Karen began to tremble. Her entire world was collapsing around her in the glare of my floodlights. She looked from the deputy to Director Vance, then to me. In my eyes, she saw no anger, no gloating, just the calm, quiet finality of a mission completed. All the bluster, all the arrogance, all the petty tyranny was gone, replaced by pure, undiluted terror. "But it was an emergency," she whispered, a pathetic, last-ditch defense. "The filth, the disease." Deputy Roberts gestured to Officer Miller, the young animal control officer, who had just arrived as a witness for the sheriff. "Officer Miller," Roberts said, "you inspected this facility yesterday at Ms. Peterson's request. What were your findings?" Miller stood tall. "My official report states the complaint was unfounded. This facility is immaculate and exceeds all standards of animal welfare. It's a model operation." That was the final nail in her coffin. Her own complaint, her own call to the authorities, had produced the very witness who now sealed her fate. Deputy Roberts turned back to Karen. "Karen Peterson, You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft, criminal mischief, and abuse of office. You have the right to remain silent." He recited the Miranda rights as he cuffed her hands behind her back. The clicking sound of the handcuffs was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. She didn't resist. She was completely broken. As the deputy led her, stumbling, to his patrol car, she looked back at my turkeys, which were now calmly preening their feathers as the sun began to rise. It was as if they knew they had won. One of my big bronze toms, the leader of the flock, puffed out his chest, fanned his magnificent tail, and let out a long, loud, triumphant gobble that echoed across the now peaceful neighborhood. It was the sound of freedom. The aftermath of Karen's spectacular downfall was swift and decisive. Her arrest sent shockwaves through Whispering Pines. The story of her embezzlement, abuse of power, and the disastrous final attempt to steal my turkeys became local legend overnight. The charges against her were serious: embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the violation of state agricultural laws. Faced with the mountain of evidence Dave and I had compiled, and the testimony of nearly the entire neighborhood, she took a plea deal that involved significant restitution payments to the HOA, a lengthy probation, and a permanent ban from ever serving on any board or fiduciary position again. She and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved away in disgrace, vanishing from the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her brother-in-law's landscaping company was dissolved, and he faced his own legal troubles for his role in the scheme. With Karen gone, the community began to heal. An interim board was appointed, with Arthur as the acting president. Their first act was to call a community-wide meeting, not in the tense clubhouse, but as a potluck barbecue on the main greenbelt. It was the first truly communal event the neighborhood had held in years. I was invited, not as a pariah, but as a guest of honor. Mark Harrison stood up and made a toast. "To Jack," he said, raising his plastic cup, "for showing us that one person standing up for what's right can give everyone else the courage to do the same." The new board, with Dave's pro bono legal guidance, undertook a complete overhaul of the HOA's covenants. All the ridiculous petty rules were struck. The vague clauses that allowed for arbitrary enforcement were clarified. A new system of transparency was put in place, with monthly financial statements posted online for all to see. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community enhancement. Maria Rodriguez's bird bath was brought out of her garage and given a place of honor in a new community garden, planted on the very green belt that Karen's brother-in-law had once billed a fortune to mow. The Harrison kids got a new playset, built by a dozen neighbors over a single weekend, stained in a defiant canyon brown. My farm was granted a permanent, official exemption, recognized not as a nuisance, but as a unique and valuable part of the community's character. People started stopping by not to complain, but to see the birds. I started hosting informal flock talks on Saturday mornings, teaching kids and adults about the different breeds, about conservation, and about the history these animals represented. Mike Kenner's legacy was no longer just my private mission. It was now shared with the whole neighborhood. The $20,000 special assessment Karen had tried to levy was, of course, scrapped. Instead, the first major project funded by the new, honest HOA was the installation of a proper crosswalk and flashing pedestrian lights on the main road, something parents had been requesting for years, but Karen had always dismissed as too expensive. The funds she had been embezzling were now being used for their intended purpose, to make life better and safer for the residents. A few months after Karen's arrest, I was sitting on my front porch at dusk, watching my turkeys make their way back to their roost for the night. The sounds from the neighborhood were different now. I could hear children laughing on the new playset, the murmur of friendly conversation from neighbors out for an evening walk. The oppressive silence of fear had been replaced by the comfortable hum of a community at peace. Arthur ambled up my driveway, his old beagle trotting alongside him. He handed me a piece of mail that had been delivered to his house by mistake. It was a postcard from a small town in rural Pennsylvania. I turned it over. The picture was of a rolling green hill dotted with cows. The note was short, written in a shaky elderly hand. "Dear Mr. Caldwell, my husband was Sergeant Mike Kenner's father. We read about what you did in the local paper online. Michael always said you were the one who could get anything done. Thank you for keeping his dream alive. You have made an old family very proud. Tears welled in my eyes. Of all the victories, this was the one that mattered most. I had fulfilled my promise. I had defended my sanctuary. But in doing so, I had inadvertently liberated an entire community. I had learned that true freedom isn't just about protecting your own piece of ground. It's about tearing down the fences of petty tyranny so that everyone has a little more room to breathe. As the last rays of sun painted the sky, my lead Tom once again puffed his chest and let out his evening gobble. It wasn't a sound of defiance anymore. It was a sound of contentment, a sound of home. And for the first time in a long time, the entire neighborhood of Whispering Pines felt like home too.